Hi everyone, welcome to GoLocal Live. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in this Tuesday afternoon. As we usually do, check in for national politics with Professor of Political Science Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, thanks for joining us today.
I'm happy to join you.
Lots to talk about as we take a look to the UK, obviously dominating both international and national press. President Donald Trump over there for a visit. Let's talk about some of the key takeaways as I believe he's having the last dinner this evening before returning. Joined soon to be departing Prime Minister Theresa May for some remarks this morning. What are you taking away from this visit?
Well, based on the remarks this morning, he sort of made it seem like she could stay in that position as long as she wanted, and he hopes that she's not going anywhere anytime soon. So it's a little bit unclear that he understands how secession works over there. But what I would say the two main takeaways are, first, Donald Trump is willing, even on these international trips, to sort of blow out of proportion the level of support that he has. To suggest that there were massive crowds cheering him when the reality was just that there were not huge crowds booing him because they weren't allowed to be is a little bit strange. But the more substantive point, I think, is that he made it clear that he wants to take advantage of the relationship that the United States has had with the United Kingdom, especially once they're no longer part of the European Union. And, he's hoping that they'll be able to negotiate and figure out how to make themselves both better off. So, my sense is that that's where his focus is going to be as soon as this deal is complete.
And speaking of international relations, let's talk a little bit about the president's remarks saying it would be foolish for Republicans to block his Mexican tariffs. Let's look south of the border and the politics involving that.
The politics involving the Mexican tariffs are actually somewhat bizarre for a couple of reasons. The first is that the members of the administration are suggesting that this is yet another carrot being extended to Mexico. It's not a carrot. It's certainly a stick. It's unclear how, if you're trying to work with a nation to ensure that we address the immigration problem, to ensure that we strengthen the border, why punishing them with economic sanctions is a good idea. And then the second problem, obviously, for Republicans is that these tariffs are going to amount to a tax increase for many of their constituents on a lot of products that people are not going to be accustomed to paying additional money for. So, I think both Democrats and Republicans are kind of scratching their heads because this wasn't anybody's idea as a positive way to move forward.
Let's stick with the Trump administration before we move to other national politics. The latest today, the White House again blocking former staffers, including Hope Hicks and the slightly perhaps lesser known former deputy counsel in Donaldson's complying with the House Judiciary's subpoenas. This seems par for the course. Where does this go?
Well, so this seems par for the course, except the administration is going to have a harder time making the case here because although they can claim executive privilege for Hope Hicks's work while she was in the White House, they certainly can't claim executive privilege for the time that she was on the campaign. And it was during the campaign that a lot of the discussion about collusion, a lot of the discussion about whether there was actually a conspiracy really took place. And none of that is privileged. So it seems like the administration and Donald Trump are trying to go out of their way to block this subpoena, and it's probably to no avail. It might also bait more and more Democrats into supporting impeachment because for a lot of them, the line that they were not willing to cross was defying a subpoena.
And speaking of campaigning, let's talk a little bit about Mayor Pete's Supreme Court proposal.
It's ridiculous. So if there's one thing that both Democrats and Republicans agree on, it's that the Supreme Court is too partisan. Nobody is walking around suggesting that the Supreme Court is not partisan enough. And so what Pete Buttigieg is proposing is a 15-person Supreme Court where you'd have 5 Democrats, you'd have 5 Republicans, and then those 10 people would select the remaining 5 justices. Now let's take out of the equation the fact that this is completely unconstitutional. It also doesn't address the major problem that people see with the court. It doesn't address the fact that we have reached a point in time where the president that nominates these justices is basically ensuring his legacy because we've gotten to the point where these justices' politics are front and center.
Do you think that this hurts? He seemed to have some momentum Pete Buttigieg, his momentum, if he had any moving forward. Do you think the American populace cares?
I don't think the American populace has any idea how a justice gets confirmed to the Supreme Court. I don't think they have any idea that the Constitution lays out the method by which it happens. And I don't think they have any idea that this was his proposal. So, this is the time during a campaign to say ridiculous things, to test them, to probably turn off some political elites and donors who might be a little bit worried about the substance underlying the campaign, but I don't think it hurts him with voters.
Do you think this was, his attempt at somewhat of a populist a proposal, but as you mentioned, again, maybe the American populace not knowing or not caring?
Well, we know that the American population cares about Supreme Court nominations when the president has the opportunity to nominate somebody to the court. We know that when it comes to issues of reproductive rights or whether to overturn Roe versus Wade, some Senate candidates have been able to marshal support and especially mobilize donors around that kind of issue. But generally speaking, these are not the issues that most candidates care about. That most voters care about. And the voters who do tend to be Republicans. So what we learned from the 2016 presidential election, for example, from exit polls, is the people who cared the most about the court were Trump voters. So it's unclear who Buttigieg is actually wooing with this kind of plan. Certainly not the intellectuals, and I don't think many Democrats either.
Speaking of campaigning, Axios had a very interesting piece today, and it's what we've seen in recent weeks as what's being dubbed deepfakes. Now, this, of course, pertains to the video that was making the rounds on social media and Facebook with Nancy Pelosi slowed down a bit to appear that she was slurring her words. The author warns that 2020 campaigns are not equipped to handle what are called deepfakes because the average voter might not know the difference. Do you think we'll see more of this manipulation of video, if you will, to make it look like the actual candidate? And is this a concern?
It is a concern. I think we will see more of it. And an additional layer of the problem is seen through the example of Nancy Pelosi. Once it became clear that the footage had been altered so that she would look impaired, a lot of mainstream media outlets did show the two clips side by side. But even at that point, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms refused to take the false video down, saying that it was up to the viewers to determine what they thought was news and what they thought was true. They wouldn't showcase it, but they were certainly not going to take it away, which demonstrates, I think, that even those companies haven't learned anything about interference in elections. It's not just about the Russians interfering, it's also about these broad campaigns of misinformation that shape viewers' attitudes and that shape voters' attitudes. And if a right-wing person can do this to, undermine Nancy Pelosi, there's nothing to suggest that people in foreign nations can do it to affect our elections. Not necessarily the presidential election, because there people are paying more attention, but you can imagine that in Senate elections or the 435 House races or all these state legislative elections where major policies are now devolved into the states, that there could be some pretty substantial implications.
So do you have concerns pertaining to that, as you just mentioned, Facebook and Twitter allowing this video to continue to be aired sort of unedited without any contrast to what the actual one was, with the potential for proliferation? How are a Facebook and a Twitter going to be able to act moving forward? And do you think we'll see continued scrutiny and perhaps action if and when more of these types of videos pop up?
Well, this is one of these examples of a policy where everybody seems to agree that it needs to be passed. Everybody seems to agree that this is not okay. And no one's actually able to do anything about it or willing to do anything about it. So I'm not confident that we won't see this kind of election interference in 2020. I'm not confident that over the course of the next few weeks and months, we won't see more examples of this. It might take a series of really high-profile examples before elected officials get together and are willing to really move. But I really think the danger here is obvious. And knowing what we know about 2016, especially on the heels of the Mueller report and the details regarding interference in the election, I'm somewhat surprised that we're sort of just discussing it as though nobody can figure out how to solve the problem.
Well, as always, we appreciate your taking the time to Skype into us up here in Providence. What do we anticipate keeping an eye on in the coming week as the president returns from the UK and more?
Well, I think the Mexico situation is obviously something that will continue. A couple of other things that I'll be watching are the Democratic candidates. We're seeing lots of attention now back on Beto O'Rourke. He made the Sunday morning news circuit this weekend, trying to inject new energy into his campaign. Kirsten Gillibrand is now selling a tote bag, suggesting that any woman who's ever been called impolite, as she had been by Chris Wallace, should buy it and support her. So I think we're seeing a lot of these lower tier candidates scramble to try and make some gains. And then the other thing that I'm looking at is Biden, who's remaining pretty much silent and just sort of sticking to the heartland, as he says, and trying to convince voters. So I think the Democratic primary will be where we're focused for the next few weeks until that first debate.
Okay, well, as always, we appreciate talking with you down from the University of Virginia. We look forward to hopefully speaking with you next week. Jennifer Lawless, thank you very much.
Of course.
Okay, don't go anywhere. We're going to get back here locally with some international implications on Go Local Live. We'll be right back.